Meeting is being recorded.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to the 13th session of the Unordinary Bible Study. As always, I give a brief introduction into the motivation around these sessions before getting right into the topic points that I want to go over. This is a partnership project I've been doing for about a little over a year now. This is the 13th session. So this is a partnership through the Active Inference Institute. So a bit of what the Active Inference Institute focuses on is we have a lot of people ambitiously involved in community empowerment and especially AI research and discussing deep topics like philosophy of mind and problems with public health and education. So it's a good place to have some good back and forth conversations. The whole role of active inference then is that is thinking about this idea that we're these agents with the capacity to not just any agents, but say human agents, because we're self-aware and we have this capacity to perceive and act on the world around us to various stimuli and prior experiences that envelop our being through this nature-nurture dynamic that unravels. And the idea of active inference then um, with this through the free energy principle is this idea that there are these boundaries of perception and action in terms of how internally and externally how we process information from the world around us. We keep track of this prior history of experiences with these embodied interactions of our senses, what we see, what we hear, our sense of balance, proprioception, interoception. And this this can provide a lot of deep insight into conversations revolving a lot of topic areas in philosophy of science, and even having discussion about spirituality, and how people uh, cope. I don't want to say cope, but like deal with battles existentially in their lives or going through their journey of how they engage with the world around them and how that impacts their world view or their world model, and how they're meaningfully engaging with others, themselves, and their environment. I call these sessions the Unordinary Bible Study largely because I'm coming at this from a more interfaith friendly perspective. And it's not just to talk about biblical scripture. I'm open to talking about even the Quran, and if anybody wants to talk about, even if it's more so in, let's say you want to talk about Buddhist philosophy and you're not a Buddhist, I don't mind that. You know, um, Maybe you have some deep insight you want to share that you feel it inspires your daily life, and so we have that sort of discussion as well. I am trying to get people from different walks of life to be involved in these conversations, not just people that can consider themselves spiritual necessarily and what that means, whether they identify they label themselves as somebody who necessarily, considers themselves a Christian or an atheist. What I'm hoping to do is kind of be able to have a grounded conversation that can involve some important talking points about like how we even use technology to interact with the world around us, and especially for a lot of us who identify as spiritual. I think it's important that we talk about like how tradition and the clash of tradition with technology and multicultural dynamics impacts our lives. So anyway, I want to get to introducing the topic points I had in mind for today, and I guess um, I last time I had a conversation, well, more of a monologue. I the 11th, not the 11th session, the 12th session that I hosted last week was more of a monologue, but there was a couple people there, so thanks for participating. But that was I was trying to have this conversation about, or at least bring some talking points up about what does it mean to uh, necessarily, what does it mean to, I guess, in a sense of relating to more of the Western culture, what does it mean to be spiritual? And a lot of people who identify as spiritual in Western culture call them, consider themselves Christian or followers of Christ. So I came at it from a different angle of, uh, a lot of us can be inspired from Christian culture, but not necessarily identify as Christian or other cultures. And so, what does that mean? And we heavily incorporate those values into our lives. But more deeply, I think that this whole discussion of spirituality um, brings us back to how we treat each other with compassion and thinking not just about ourselves in this compassionate interaction and realizing that the world is bigger than ourselves. And what does that mean? And how do we move forward, realizing that the world is bigger than ourselves? And without further ado, if you guys want to kind of there's a lot of people that have a lot to say on this call, so I'll let you guys lead into the discussion since I gave a monologue last time. But I guess let's kind of go at this from an angle of like talking about the sense of compassion, and this is what people are really want to uh, talk about and channel their efforts is this compassionate sense of being when it comes to talking about spirituality and like how we come from go towards this well anyway, so I'll let you guys lead that conversation and see where we can go from there. Not sure who wants to start with that, but because I think that's what it really comes down to is like this idea of like selfness versus selflessness. And I know and that's and I think that one way about talking about this clash between the thesis and the antithesis is this clash of opposites, and that that gets me thinking about how we're in conflict with desire and necessity, and the sense of being in conflict with our with in this conflict necessarily has to do with thinking about even primal instinct versus how we try to be these justified reasoners necessarily. Um, and
Yeah,
then
I could jump in a little bit. My mind isn't incredibly lucid at the moment, but as far as it relates to the idea of compassion and the idea of the sort of dialectic you mentioned between self and selflessness, well, I think it gets really boiled down to self and other. There's two frameworks I want to discuss here. One is Otto Rank. So Otto Rank writes about the will and the counter will. And he says that the will actually is born in life in its first encounter with the counter will. And the counter will for an individual in a process of maturation is reality, is other, is world, is sort of things that already exist. And so in contact, in confrontation, in encounter with a continual encounter with tension between self and other, our own concept of self is developed, is iterated upon. In terms of active inference, we develop our own concept of self from the experiences that we have, and we have notable experiences in that entire story of experiences that continually develop a sense of self that is, for a particular stage of development, inextricably linked with the self-other tension. However, what's interesting here is that if you go into the mystic literature, because you spoke about compassion, if you go into the mystic literature is about this overflowing compassion for other people, for mankind, so much to the point that it's this idea of a union of man with mankind, an idea of a dissolution of the ego, a dissolution of, concept of self and non-self. They merge into one, a person, they belong everywhere and they belong nowhere. Khalil Gibran, you have many of the Sufi mystics, the Christian mystics write about these things extensively as well. And also you have Eastern concepts of non-duality. So what we're noticing here is that there certainly is a dynamic between self and other, but there is a developmental trajectory of that dynamic between self and other that, in terms of the religious traditions, arrives at a final point of sort of a collapse between self and non-self. Not in the sense that there is no self remaining, but kind of in the sense that the concept of self has been liberated from the tension, you could say. Um, so that's something to throw in there. And I'll add this real quick. As I have been doing more research about in terms of the development of the brain, I have some hypotheses that I have yet to test or really research, but that appear intuitive to me. And these hypotheses are linked to the developmental trajectory of the three minds in the brain. And so, is there an order of development here? And in my own way of thinking, in terms of the terms that are used in the neurological world, but we can sort of dilute these into or reframe these in philosophical terms. In terms of the brain, there's a tripartite model that describes three basic regions of the brain that have three basic functions: a default mode network that is concerned with internal processing, self-referential thought, an executive control network that is occupied with executive inhibitive control, and then a saliency network that is a mediator between these two. What's interesting is that I think that actually that there is a process of maturity in terms of these regions and their integration with one another. And if I could postulate a particular path of development that relates to the theme of compassion, it begins with this, you could say, you could even say unilevel integration of the brain that is largely rooted in the default mode network, which is completely concerned with self, that cannot really articulate, it cannot really put things into form, inhibit in any sense. But as the individual matures from infancy up until a particular age in adolescence, it is confronted with the world, which eventually I think becomes internalized as particular elements of the executive control network. Or you could say, in philosophical terms, this idea of becoming in the executive control network and this idea of being in the default mode network. But as this tension is lived with, a lot of individuals, I think, adopt a way of living that comes from without, that comes externally projected onto them. And so this sort of becomes the mediator for them. Even though there is a mediator within the brain, there is a sort of adoption of an external mediating quality factor. You could say that the existential experience is a confrontation with that mediating factor, maybe a rejection of an external mediating factor and the beginning of a quest towards an internal mediating factor. And I think in that tension between self and other, progressively as time goes on, the capacity and strength of an intermediating development, an inner directing development is made. And I think that's precisely the saliency network in the brain. And as that develops, you have an entirely globally integrated system that really is, paradoxically, it has separated itself from concepts of other. In the same way the mystic or the monk separates themselves from the collective, it has sort of separated itself from these external conceptions, not in terms of full freedom, but in terms of deriving its own understanding. Only then is there some idea of maybe non-duality that emerges in that? Um, but these are postulations on my part, and they're uh, in infancy. They're still a bit inchoate.
I think that to add on to that, we're finding out even more with a lot of the neuroscience and cognitive science literature that's been coming out that the primary regions of the limbic system in the brain, especially when it comes to our executive functioning, are competing with each other in how they process and information and how our perception works, right? Because like we have the insular cortex and we have the prefrontal cortex, we have the hippocampus and the amygdala and all these different networks here that interface especially through the default mode network and so um and this kind of explains the extremes of how this competitive dynamic may or may not play out based on like this nature versus nurture dynamics, right? Where we're thinking about like the genome as opposed to the epigenetic shaping of of our genes and like how that impacts our behavior and how we're also simultaneously interacting with our surroundings as these systems are competing with each other. And then like we're these multicellular, multi-agent systems that like we also have a whole gut biome as well that is so closely interacting with our nervous system, right? So like a lot of people, well, I can preach about food science and like how the food we eat, impacts certain, not all types of people, but there's certain populations of people that are impacted by the food they eat because that impacts like how the bacteria in their gut competes to
Mhm.
coordinate with each other too. So not only are the primary regions of our limbic system competing in terms of attentional and perceptual dynamics, but even each of the cells in our body compete as well. So it's interesting how this like we not necessarily call it a tit-for-tat dynamic, especially in nature, with how cells engage, like interact with each other, because like we have this whole colony of cellular subsystems in our body, and then on top of that, we have to think about the dynamics of our nervous system. That thinking from the top level and the top down, necessarily in the bottom up, how the nervous system impacts our interactions and then how our interactions impact the nervous system, right? So you see this kind of duality collapse. I guess it took me some time to get there to this kind of duality collapse of the top down and the bottom up. And it seems like we have this like, thesis and antithesis thing happening all over again that, we can even talk about on the side of systems biology and, developmental biological
Well, if I could
implications.
pause
Yeah.
you there because I think it
Yeah.
might be a point that we can generate more discussion on. So you say
Yeah.
that you see how this top-down and bottom-up approach are collapsing, and there's this thesis-antithesis. But in terms of the mind, if we think about, so obviously cellular systems, nervous system, these other systems where in which these things are competing. But let's think about in the mind where they're competing, it's not merely a dualistic mechanism. It's not merely an antithesis thesis because as the
Mhm.
mind generates more consciousness, even you just articulated it. You articulated some notion of self-consciousness of the dynamic that's occurring in your brain, which indicates that there is another thing that's going on, a third mind, a third sort of mechanism that increasingly embodies the role of mediating that top-down, bottom-up. Um, and so if we can observe that dynamic, in ourselves, it might give us more intuition to what's kind of going on in these other processes as well, or and also into really what it means to be self-conscious and conscious as such.
I could I could jump in here on those tensions. Or thanks, Ennis, and thanks, Jesse. Um, so, oh, one way is to try to understand them just in terms of our human life, and also it comes up in scripture. Um, and just to say, like I've been investigating with colleagues and with Ennis and others, how do things come to matter to us? So we're just collecting examples from real life. That's very helpful. But this is linking into something I had done before that relates to Maslow's hierarchy of needs, trying to make sense of that. I don't know if I could share a screen. Is that possible? But that would help. But if we think of like this tension between the unconscious and the conscious, so let's say our unconscious knows all kinds of stuff, is showing us stuff, and the conscious doesn't know but's asking questions, etc. The unconscious, let's say, is concerned about the past. It's looking at all these things of the past. The unconscious, I mean, the conscious is, let's say, looking at the future, things that could go wrong, etc. And then there's like Anna said, like a third mind that just has general concern. So it's not necessarily even concern for myself, let's say in the past or in the future, but just for anybody. And so it decides like what to do. So if I look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs, there's like six needs structurally, and three have to do with that past-looking mind. So like, the body is, you want to survive, and so to survive, you cling to what you have, but you want to survive tomorrow also. So then you get more than what you need, for security. And then, but you want other people to be able to survive too. Like you have this social need. So for them to be able to cling to what they have, you don't want to rock the boat. So you try to avoid extremes and be normal, and that helps people. That satisfies the social need. So for every one of these needs, you have a way to just address it. And similarly with the forward looking, instead of the body surviving, like self-esteem, like where your spirit, your psyche survives. And then could it survive tomorrow? Okay, so for self-esteem, every time you choose the good over the bad, that pumps you up. But if you choose the better over the worse, that helps with freedom, like for tomorrow, so that tomorrow you could position yourself for the self-esteem. And then for just in general, you want to choose the best over the rest. You want to be extreme because if you're extreme, it makes it easier for other people to choose the good over the bad. So those are all just mechanical ways of addressing these needs. And those two minds have their picture of the three minds. That's why we have six. But the actual mind that lets go of everything we know and everything we don't know and just sits there in this void, that's the mind that can have this general concern. And so there's two ways that happen. One is that you can have a bunch of needs, but if you want to ignore your own needs, you take up the needs of another. Okay, so you can ignore your own needs by taking up the needs of another, or you can be like Jesus said, be perfect. You don't have to have any needs, possibly. Just be perfect, and just live like that. So that's just not have needs, and so that's a godly way. So there's these two ways to kind of let go of ourselves, and going back to Jesse's theme of how do we pick up a bigger picture than ourselves. And so the idea that there's a God beyond us, life doesn't have to be good. I mean, life doesn't have to be fair. God doesn't have to be good, but we can let go of ourselves. We can look at the bigger picture. And so caring about others is a practical way to ignore our own needs. There's those two ways to do that, I think. So this is something that came up.
Yeah, I
How
think when it comes to like focusing on others, like maybe there's some dynamic going on there that we're not necessarily giving up all our needs or sacrificing our needs necessarily, but there could be some more complicated dynamic where, okay, like it's sort of like this adaptive tit-for-tat situation, maybe it could vary. So that was someone else wanted to say something, so I wanted to add that because I
Sure.
thought it could be more complicated there.
Well, I just wanted to ask a bit in terms of, to me, that all seems very coherent, Andreas, the idea of compassion in that sense. But I'm also curious, as to what your thoughts are about how sort of development towards that perspective occurs in an individual. For example, how a person might go from, selfishness to more compassion, or, you know, you know, is there such a developmental trajectory that you could chart out? Um,
I don't know. First of all, maybe just to say, like, Jesus seems to refer to these things. So, like in the Beatitudes, if you see,
mhm.
there's 8 blessings in the beginning of the Sermon on the Mount, and they're organized, I think, by these means. So, like, the first one is, "Blessed are the poor in spirit; there's the kingdom of heaven." But then it goes like, "Blessed are those who mourn." So that would be survival. Like, "Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth." So that's like security. "Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness." I think that would be, I guess, social according to this, and so on. So like they go that, but and then also he has these "I am" statements, and I think that those there's 8 of those. I think that those reference those also. Like, for example, "I am the resurrection and the life." Right? So like if you cling to your own life, then you're going to die. But if you cling to God's glory, you see, then you will live and be resurrected. So, or like the gate for the sheep. So, like that would be like for security, let's say, right? Or so there's these different there's these different things also. But in terms of how we come to that, I don't know. I think that those three minds are with us from the beginning, but we have to foster that third mind. So situations, I guess, where we 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 have this conflict between the mind that's looking backwards, and then the mind that's looking forwards. And so
Yeah.
I think
If
we need that. It comes from that conflict, I think.
Here I think Kazimierz Dabrowski's theory of positive disintegration might be incredibly useful as
Positive
something
what? Positive.
theory of positive disintegration. Now,
Okay.
I'm actually familiar with his youngest student who runs his website, and we're collaborating a little bit. And I've known him since the start of this year, actually. So it's been about a year since I've known him. But when I first read his theory, I thought it was the most cogent articulation of the psychological process of uh, of the development of mystical development. And basically, he's talking about personality development through positive disintegration. So one of the big themes there was that he talks about how the mind is in that there are particular stages of integration that are kind of rigid, and then existential ruptures or traumas or things of that nature cause that structure to de-rigidify. And I think in terms of what you were saying, that lead to the development, the fostering of that third mind. Because when I think about in my younger life, because I'm trying to kind of understand my own process of maturation as an individual human and project that in my own self to maybe the collective maturation of mankind to see if there's a similarity there in terms of maturation. And in my own development, I can look back, especially when I'm younger, and find that there had been a period, especially when I was very young, where I did not know what to do. It was really just maybe I would just follow my own feeling, right? And then there came a period where in following my feeling for a thing, I would be punished or rewarded. And then in being punished or rewarded, I began to develop a sense of how I ought to act. Now, I think that is kind of grounded in living in the world practically, but then there's a spiritual element that an individual begins to encounter. And that happened for me really much later in my life, maybe not much later, but towards the, end of my adolescence, around 18, 19, when I began to become more interested in these spiritual ideas. And then there began to exist spiritual conflicts within. And those spiritual conflicts that you could say they kind of posed as a trauma for the former structure. No longer do I feel rewarded for particular behaviors in terms of my own inner feelings or a biological sort of sense of self. But then there's this higher plane, perhaps. Um, but all of this seems to be conditioned for me by this conflict between this sort of bottom up and then top down, the conflict between these two networks, and increasing perhaps you know I think in some sense existential confrontation, some form of trauma that forces one to think differently is very useful here. And I think this is where we can circle back to what Jesse was saying earlier about sort of a multicultural society, engaging with sort of these different formulas for life. those kind of necessarily pose an existential question for individuals that prompt perhaps this existential search, which in a negative sense leads to a lot of existential angst, and despair, perhaps, or worry about how to live one's life. But in a positive sense, it fosters and cultivates the ability to become more self-responsible and be more self-conscious. And then maybe from that tension, there is something we could chart as a path of development towards this idea of compassion in the brain.
I like that, and I it sparks something in me. But I want to ask if somebody else would like to jump in, and then I would jump in. But who would speak?
Well, one thing that I found kind of interesting, if I can say, with respect, when the question was asked, like, what essentially motivates this like theotic like change of heart, and this like I think as it was touched on later, like the cultivating of this like indwelling, like what motivates that? Like, okay, here's some practical outcomes for if we do, accomplish this like way, but what motivates it? And I think that's interesting for one that like reasonably, understandably, we come up short. Like, why should that even be? Uh, like, I feel like that would be something that we ought to already understand. And maybe that's part of the issue is that there's this tension between like the reflective state of awareness, like was discussed earlier, versus like when there's this like almost deep sense of knowing, apart from, you know, a woo-woo way to describe that, like this empathetic or social nature, I think is a fair place to start. If that helps. I think this does very much speak to sociality. But yeah, I mean, I don't know that I have all the answers either. It's just I think that's interesting. What would motivate the humble servant motif to adopt that? Um, is that like a fair rephrasing of the question at least? Like even if I'm not answering it myself?
I found it helpful. I found that's very helpful. I found Greg or anybody else. So, what this comes to mind, and I want to give a shout out to Alexander Sabine, who's in the active inference world, because he has a theory, I think, of coherence, of rupture, and then regeneration. I think he calls it CRR, and so it's very much to
Very
what
interesting.
Ennis is talking about. And I came to something similar maybe 12 years ago. I was in Chicago. I was taking courses in improv theater at the Annoyance Theater. And I thought, oh, I want to do meaningful improv. So I thought, I will make a list of as many as I can. And it ended up being more than 100 meaningful experiences in my life. And so I can have those in mind. And then I was very interested in that list and I started studying them. I think I studied like 30 of them, but they all basically have that very same form that you have an old self and then something happens where you let go of that and then you take up a new self, more mature. And the crucial part is that in order to let go of yourself, you have to be loved, supportive. So, an example story would be when I was in fourth grade, all the boys started cursing, and I thought, well, I need to talk like that too because it's just the vernacular. I can't, I mean, that's how we talk. So, but there, and everyone was had a crush on Lacey Diaz, and so, um, but she told me, she said, "Why are you cursing?" And I go, "Well, you curse, everybody curses." But she said, "But it doesn't suit you." And then I thought about that, and I just felt liberated in the sense that I don't have to be like everybody else, and it's not hurting everybody else if I'm just being like me. So that was a very beautiful form, I'd say, like of love. She cared about me to say that, and it freed me, and I was able to be a different person thanks to her. So I think basically everything has those forms. Now, how does that relate to these conflicts we were talking about? I don't know. But the idea that love is the crucial ingredient for us to be able to let go of ourselves,
Yeah.
um, I like that.
I want to jump in there real quick because I think it's very interesting because even there you kind of touch on a motif that's developed in the transition between the Old Testament and the New Testament. This movement from God more as an entity of fear to God as
Mhm.
an entity of love. And the thing that you said about, well, in the moment of acceptance, that there was a letting go and then supposedly a liberation, a freedom. Well, that to me very much so mirrors the Christian narrative in some sense, that the idea of love, acceptance, this and that will set one free. But I also think to your point about, the analogy in the fourth grade, everyone's talking like this, I will talk like them. There's a whole school of mimetic thought. And I think Rene Girard is a big proponent of this school, mimetic desire, that most people, their identities, desires, the way that they, choose to live their lives is largely just based on imitation of other people. So there is something about the human dynamic that desires two things at the same time. On the one hand, it seeks to be like others. It seeks to belong, to sort of be within the group. But then at the same time, it wants to be unique. It wants to be different. It wants to be its own thing. Um, and so in that dialectic or in that dynamism, there is this sort of tension. But on the point of acceptance, I think what's also interesting there, well, there is, I think, a lot of people that are also seeking, you could say, acceptance from other people or from other things. For example, a person that, is seeking a particular degree is seeking acceptance from the university, or a person that's seeking a particular job is seeking maybe a vocational form of acceptance. But then there seems to be a broader theme here, once you sort of transcend the sociality of a seeking of acceptance from oneself, in oneself, or at least from maybe something beyond the material world. And this, I think, takes us back, loops us back to this theme of development, where in which I think all of us are privy to the reality that in our youth and in development stages of our life, that we did seek things externally and in this sort of, you could say, selfish sense, even though we were not aware. But then it moves to this different frame. And from them, I think it goes from this, maybe pulling in to a giving outward and overflowing sort of thing. And then it also, reflects the aphorism in the Bible that to give is to receive. But like I said, I think all here, if I could, note a theme in the ideas that I have been sharing, it seems to me that there is a developmental tension of opposites which we can maybe note in the brain, but and we also see other examples, as Jesse noted earlier. I think you said the limbic system, but in the nervous system, in the gut, in the gut biome, where that tension itself seems necessary as a developmental pathway towards some higher concept. And I think I don't know who you said it was, Alex Sabin of the Active Inference Institute, Andreas.
Yeah. Mhm.
I would imagine that there's a developmental idea there because the core sort of idea in Dabrowski's theory for at the least, and also Otto Rank and sort of other people that I've read, is that there is a developmental journey there. And this also sort of mirrors some of the mystic concepts of a dark night of the soul, which really, in non-mystical terms, is this, I think, what is language that you use, the degeneration and regeneration? Um,
I think it was a coherence, rupture, and then regeneration.
exactly, exactly. So there's this
He
coherence.
works with, I think he works with children. He's interested in, children's development. So
Yes, yes, yes.
sees this in Piaget, he sees this in Erickson, and I've
Yeah, yeah,
related
Eric Erickson. Yeah,
Maslow. And so I think I'm starting to understand how this is working. Like the unconscious mind gives us needs, basically. It says, you need you need this, you need that, you know that. The conscious mind responds with these operating principles, so it's kind of mechanical. Where does the freedom come in? The freedom comes in from the third mind. And what it says, look, when you, like I was saying, like when you cling to what you have,
yeah,
but you don't have to cling to yourself. You could cling to the glory of God. Or
exactly.
like so these are the I am statements, and I
Yes,
can
yes, yes.
go
But
through them. But the gate for the sheep. So instead of getting more than what you need, for yourself, like, well, no, if it's the intent of God, the intent of God is that we, leave, go outside of the gate and then come back in, let's say, and have all this richness of all kinds. Or instead of avoiding extremes for the sake of the social need, instead of doing that with reference to ourselves, we could do it like the example of God. So like the way, the truth, and the life. If you focus on the example of God, then you're avoiding extremes by from that point of view. Or like choosing the good over the bad, like for self-esteem, instead of focusing on our choices, like the love of God, like focusing on the love of God, the good shepherd, or the work of God, the light of the world, like for this choosing the better over the worse for the sake of freedom, or the command of God, like the true vine. So for self-fulfillment, like choosing the best, being extreme, but being extreme with regard to the command of God, or the bread of life, like taking up the needs of another. So that's the kind of that's where the freedom is just a little subtle thing. Like, is it with regards to my own self, or is it with regards to what's bigger than me?
Yes.
And
Well, okay.
enough.
This is, I think, the idea I'm trying to push here too, and I want to hear people's thoughts on it. Is that I think what I'm trying to say as well is that there is a particular processual process of or process of development that we can notice in the brain that is mediated by this dynamic tension of opposites, these two networks that continually integrate a more coherent sense of the third mind. And
Mhm.
that process of cultivation is necessarily intertwined with the concept of the tension between these two networks. For example, the coherence, rupture, reintegration idea is that rupture is necessary. What happens in the rupture? A sort of new framework has to be adopted. Something has to be, adapted, updated. And so in this continual process of updating, it seems to me that we have this dynamic particular path that's kind of different for every person that engages in it. But that particulars or that dynamism is developed by a relation between self and other in the world. And as
Mhm.
that development develops across time, is it possible that we could note a end point of development or a sufficient point of development that mimics what we understand to be theologically true in Christian scripture? Um, and,
Or
and, and
you simply have to read the phenomenology of spirit. Like like you simply have to read it. Everything you're saying, I can't really speak so much in a neuroscientific register because I don't know neuroscience as well as you do. I don't think. Uh, but what you're talking about of consciousness, what we might call pre-philosophical or natural consciousness, uh, developing itself or negatively sublating uh, to into its end through in and through this developmental process into absolute knowledge, in which the self knows that he is not other to the world and
Mhm.
knows that the structure of his cognition is the structure of the world. That is the entire phenomenology of spirit. You know,
Well, that
our interpersonal relations are also heavily treated there, particularly
yes.
at the master slave dialectic and ethical life and other things. Uh, this is all part of that developmental journey, and also I would say uh, kind of conceptually recovering the truth that you see in revealed scripture is the bridge from the second to the last chapter, from revealed religion to
Mm,
absolute knowledge, where revealed religion at the stage of revealed religion, consciousness has the truth, but it's in the form of representation. uh, so
mm.
it's still not what Hegel would call happy. It is only happy when it grasps it conceptually, and then that is absolute knowledge.
And I would agree there. I mean, I have not read the phenomenology of the spirit. However, I was reflecting on our previous conversation, Tree Man, and the speculative philosophy idea, basically in that, because I think for me, my own understandings, I've read many people, but ultimately the way that I've been able to gain a sense of what's going on in the cognitive neuroscience world is through an intuition of the development and working of my own mind. And I think that seems to be, as what you said earlier, the mind coming to consciousness of itself. And it seems to me that in terms of the neuroscience world, the process and mechanism through which that occurs, it relates back to the Alexander Sabin sort of idea, but it's a dialectic. It's just a dialectic. But the third mind is central here as a developmental thing that's continually gaining greater consciousness of itself, of its own mechanism of understanding itself. And
Yes.
that itself, relates, I would say, very intimately, very deeply with, the theological concepts of Christianity, the mystical concepts of the religions of the world, only it perhaps has not yet been adapted in language as such.
You're exactly right. Thought or cognition supplies itself with its own determinations. It reveals itself to be what it is, and the philosopher witnesses that or follows it along its journey. You're exactly right.
Yeah, and this is where the mystical life kind of reveals itself as something that ought to be studied in relation to neuroscience, because the mystical life or the meditative life is about silence, is about contemplation, is about letting these things pass in the brain, is about becoming more and more aware of the self, of what's going on internally, of the relations and desires that one has in relation to others, and these other things that are going on. And so all of these things seem intimately caught up for me. And I think, a basic project is, well, there's many, many projects, but um, yes, a
Yeah,
basic
well,
project seems to be integration.
yes, yes, you're exactly right. Yes, integration is key, and I would just all I can do is point you in the direction of Hegel's system. I think that this was figured out like 200 years ago, but yeah.
Yeah, well, you could say it was figured out 2,000 years ago, or maybe even longer than that. But I think Christ expresses it in full. Um, but
Yes,
I
that's
think,
true.
yeah,
That's true.
yeah,
But at a conceptual level, which
sure,
is
sure,
what you
sure,
see,
yeah, yeah,
which is what you seem to be after. Yeah.
yeah. And I think there's varying levels of conceptual understanding with other people as well. But yeah, I think particularly what is of note, interesting note of Hegel for me as well, in addition to all of this, is that I think Hegel, there is a micro macro cosmic relationship in the unfolding of the spirit in the individual as well as the unfolding of the spirit collectively. And you can map on these things to one another. And that methodology of mapping on the individual collective mechanisms itself gives further insight when you use the neurological terms or psychological terms to try and see what's going on there. And I think it reveals a lot in terms of historical development and other ideas, but it is very complex at the same time.
Yeah, I wish I had engaged more with philosophy, or rather with psychology and with neuroscience. I wish I could tell it to you in language that's native to you, but I can't do that. Unfortunately, I'm just not familiar with neuroscience or psychology that well.
Sure.
Yeah, if I could add, it seems like this idea of thinking about things in like trialities or like a trilemma relation, it extends to conceptual knowledge for many, when we try to decompose how concepts come together in terms of their terminologies, it seems like, on the one hand, from mathematics, we have this idea of a function that could have the input and the output and the mediation that allows the mapping of the input to the output, right? Now I'm thinking that, okay, well, we can think of the top and the bottom, well, I don't necessarily think it's like the top and the bottom are entirely opposites, but we can think of in terms of thinking about things in high order, um, or hierarchies. We could think of the top being the intricate integration of the bottom in terms of how the bottom comes together and how embeddings between uh, from the bottom link to the top. And on the other hand, we can think about the mediation, right? We have the top, the bottom, and then the top down is the mediation of the top to the bottom, and then the bottom up is the mediation from the bottom to the top. So the mediary would be, you're thinking about things in minds. I'm thinking about things in terms of conceptual perspectives. We could think about going back to the unconscious and the conscious mind here. We can think about like sort of the quasi-conscious or the not so conscious and the unconscious mind, right? That there's this mediation happening
Yeah,
between
yeah.
unconscious and not entire mediation
It's
because there
developing
are
mediation.
yeah, because there are things that we're not going to entirely track
Yeah, yeah.
unconsciously, right? On the one hand, whether it's a bunch of noise from sensory perception that we're not really paying attention to, even if we try to, because that's just an anthropomorphization of like, okay, what can I actually pay attention to in my immediate awareness? So it seems like there's this, and then that can even relate back to thinking about decomposing the Trinity and thinking about God in the sense of channeling how we as humans channel our inner compassion
Yeah.
regarding our sense of self, the other, and the ecosystem, right? So it seems like we can think of things in threes in a manner of conceptual terminology abundance here, but um, that's something I figured I'd add into it to build on
Yeah.
Ines'
I,
point.
I'd add, Enos, in our or Ennis, in our last conversation, you went on a little bit about universality and particularity.
Yeah.
Uh, that's another. And further, you correctly observed the unity of particularity and universality, or rather,
Yeah.
the fact that the particular is universal and particular, and the
Yeah. Yeah.
universal is universal and particular.
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly.
So despite both being universal and particular, they are still distinct, and that distinction is individuality. So you have this other trinity: universal, particular, and individual. This
Yeah. Yeah.
is
Yeah.
like this Trinitarian structure is reflected at all levels. So you have UPI, as I just went over, you have cognition, self-cognition, and metacognition. It's the same Trinity, just reflected at different scales.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I would agree. I would agree. The only thing that's interesting, another thing that's interesting here to me, like I said, is like, well, it was there a developmental trajectory of these three minds in terms of human organisms, in terms of our own, and what I like to think theologically is that there appears to me in the Christian story, going all the way back to its origin in the Old Testament, that God goes from a sort of monotheistic God. A God is one, and then there's a God is two, as in that there's a son and a father, and there's a tension of opposites there between particular and universal, between exile and return, between life and death, and then you have the resurrection of the Son, and you have the arrival of the Holy Spirit, and so then you have sort of passing from the tension of opposites, a resurrection, so this rupture to a resurrection, that then is the arrival, and then there comes the arrival of the third. And so, in my own mapping of like I was saying earlier, if we could map on a maturation process to our own individual the development of the mind, maybe we could say it moves from this monotheism to a dualism of or
Yeah.
tension of two, then to a three.
So you're a filioque, bro, and that by the way, I also am. Filioque is based. Uh,
Is that filioque? Let me hear.
Filioque is the doctrine that the Holy Spirit issues from both the Father and the Son, as opposed to just the Father. Uh,
Okay, okay, is that what that is? Okay,
yeah,
okay,
yeah,
okay,
I think the standard Hegelian answer is that filioque is true. So good for
okay.
you.
Is that really what I'm articulating there? Because that's what
Yes.
you've okay, then that's
Yes.
very useful for me. Thank you. I will
I
write
want
that down.
I want to thank everybody. I have to leave now because it's late here in Lithuania, but I really learned a lot. I'm glad, to connect with you, Treeman, and Harlequin, and all. And so, thank you, Jesse. And look forward to continuing. So, peace and love.
Peace and love to you as well,
Very nice.
brother. Yeah, so I think like in terms of like this association between the father and the son, the channeling of compassion, like the father's compassion to the son, we get the spirit, right? The Holy Spirit is that channel. And then we get this triality again. This is how we get the Trinity relation essentially. Just to build on that, this filioque dynamic. Yeah.
Interesting. So I'm reading a little bit on the orthodoxy now, and filioque, 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 filioque. Very interesting. Um, yeah, this could be this. I think that this sort of research has a lot of uses in a lot of different areas. This is where I think this entire project, the interdisciplinary project, is so useful because, and this is where the learning of different languages is also so useful because then you can translate some of these ideas that have hitherto sort of been walled off in their own terminology to other domains and thus perhaps reduce division.
Yeah, that's the name of the game. You're right.
That is, yeah. I might also head out in a second because I have to go get some food, and I had a long shift today, as I said earlier. But I wanted to leave everybody with something that I was also brought to my mind. There is a myth I read about Dionysus, and from a friend that Dionysus was originally, I don't know if anyone knows, but the ancient Greek myth. So Dionysus was really Zagreus, and when Zagreus was born, or after he was born, he was tempted by the Titans with a mirror. And he looked in the mirror and then he was shattered into many pieces. And then Apollo came to Dionysus and put him back together. and then Zeus struck him with lightning, and then he was reborn as Dionysus. But I think there's also a sort of developmental motif here that sort of mirrors, I think, this idea of coherence, rupture, reintegration, or positive discrimination, or sort of the dialectic, but also goes back to the start of the conversation about compassion and the self-other. What do you see in the mirror? What is the other? There is no self without the other. Um, and that sort of mirror concept is very, very common in a lot of psychological and mystical literature, as a means of gaining greater awareness of self. Um, and I think that you could project that dynamic on to the development of the brain. So
Yeah,
anyhow,
you'll find that structure everywhere. Like
yeah.
if you're
And
looking right, you'll find it. You'll find it everywhere.
that's
You'll
true.
find
That's
it
true.
in
You will find
nature.
it everywhere. You'll find it in trees as well.
Yeah,
Trees
yeah.
and men. And so, but I will take my leave there. This was a great discussion. Had my neurons firing. So I appreciate everyone. I appreciate Jesse for setting this up. Like always, I look forward to the next one.
Thank
Um,
you. It's been a
yeah.
pleasure as always.
All right. And I'll talk to you guys later. Bye.
Take it
Take care.
easy, Ines.
Yeah. Bye.
Yeah, yeah, now's a good time. We've been on for about a little over an hour, and I think we covered a lot of content, and I think this discussion like provide a lot of context for those who have been wrestling with what is the Trinity and how does this expand outside of like how is this just not exclusive to Christianity and thinking about uh these trilemma relations and then having this discussion about okay, like enveloping our sense of compassion, this has this deepness in it in terms of like how we decompose things into threes necessarily. And I think that's been very fruitful. And thinking about decomposing things into threes also helps us form associations, right? Because, going back to mathematics and the anatomy of a function, right? And its representation, which we necessarily usually call an algebra, we have the input that maps to the output, and then the actual mapping that mediates the input to the output, right? And then this extends beyond to talking about the unconscious mind, and the conscious mind, and this mediation between how the conscious mind is aware of the unconscious mind, and into how that might play a role in how we integrate information in our lives, like especially when we're thinking about like dream sequences, like how we're necessarily sometimes interacting. We have this opportunity to interact with our unconscious mind in a way. So I think this is very interesting. I guess next time we can have. I do want to get more into a discussion about, well, let's dial this back and think about the problems of today and what's going on with technology. I think in a couple of the previous sessions, a little bit of 11, maybe the latest session, um, and 10, we talked a little bit about that. But I want to thank everybody again for participating. I don't know if anybody has anything they want to close with, any remarks. It's been a nice, great discussion. And again, I appreciate everybody participating.
Yeah, I would remark and say that this is really a community of thinkers. I mean, you guys have brains that work, and you use them, and it's a pleasure to be invited. Like, thank you, Kathmandu, for inviting me here, and it's a pleasure to meet all of you.
Absolutely. It's been a pleasure like always, and it's been a blast having, the whole onslaught of guests for over the past year now has been amazing. We've, from different walks of life, like people with doctorates, people that necessarily don't have doctorates, but also, provide a lot of interesting insights into like, like how do we address this dilemma that many people are talking about, the meaning crisis, and how we how we grapple with life when it comes to these means to an end necessarily. And it's important to have these conversations. I don't really see them getting on this level, especially when we talk about Bible studies, right? Most of the time, it's seems very amoralistic, the kind of conversations we have in terms of how we relate scripture to our life, or not even just thinking about the Bible necessarily, but thinking about, how can we understand, have this sense of mindfulness in how we live our lives, that acknowledging it's not just about us, it's about our engagements around ourselves and each other, and ecosystems abound. So yeah, all right. Thank you all for participating, and I look forward to seeing some of you again next time for sure. All righty.